I track whales in the Pacific Ocean. Something big is hunting them. 14 years I had been conducting cetacean population surveys in the North Pacific. 14 years of small research vessels, long transect lines, binoculars, hydrophone arrays, and the particular discipline of counting animals that spent 90% of their lives beneath the surface of an ocean that covered a third of the planet. Population survey work was different from behavioral research, different from tagging studies, different from acoustic monitoring. It was a specific and unglamorous discipline that required you to cross the same stretches of ocean repeatedly, in the same seasons, on the same routes. Recording what you saw with enough consistency that the numbers you produced were comparable to the numbers from last year and the year before and the year before that. It required you to resist the pull of any individual animal that was interesting or unusual, to keep the vessel on the transect line, to count and log and move on. 14 years of counting and logging and moving on had given me the most comprehensive longitudinal cetacean density dataset for the northeastern Pacific that existed outside of government programs. And government programs had budget cycles and personnel turnover, and I had neither. I had the same methodology applied to the same routes in the same seasons by the same person for 14 years. And the value of that consistency was precisely that. It made anomalies visible in a way that inconsistent data never could. I knew what the northeastern Pacific looked like in terms of cetacean distribution. I knew where the blue whales concentrated in summer and where they went in winter. I knew where the humpback pods worked the upwelling zones north of Hawaii, and where the sperm whales dove along the seamount chains, and where the fin whales ran their transit routes between feeding grounds. I knew the Pacific the way a farmer knows a field, not the romance version of knowing, but the working version. The version built from thousands of hours of looking at the same water and understanding what was normal about it and what wasn't. And what I noticed beginning in the spring of the year I am going to tell you about was not the disappearance of any individual animal. It was the disappearance of an area, a specific region of the North Pacific, approximately 400 kilometers across in its longest dimension, from which cetacean presence had essentially vanished and which was moving. My name is Dr. Sarah Okafor. I am 43 years old. I grew up in Lagos and came to marine biology through a circuitous route involving a biochemistry degree I did not finish, and a volunteer position on a whale survey vessel that I took at 22 because it paid for passage across the Atlantic and changed everything about what I thought my life was going to look like. I did my doctorate at the University of British Columbia and joined the Pacific Cetacean Monitoring Initiative as its senior survey biologist at 31. And I have been running the initiative's Northeastern Pacific Survey program since then. The initiative is a small organization, 4 full-time scientific staff, a rotating cohort of research assistants, and the survey vessel Meridian, which is a 24-meter aluminum-hulled research vessel that I have spent more of my adult life aboard than I have spent in any apartment I have ever rented. I know the Meridian the way I know the Pacific, from the inside out, and I know the Pacific the way I know the Meridian, which is to say completely and with the permanent awareness that complete knowledge and full understanding are not the same thing. The survey anomaly that I am going to describe began of in the data in April, and I did not fully understand what I was looking at until August, which is a longer lag than I like to admit. But the data was subtle at first, and I was looking for what I expected to find. And the most dangerous limitation of longitudinal survey work is that consistency of expectation can blind you to change at the edges of what you're looking at. I am telling you that because I think it is important. And I think it is important because what I missed in those 4 months from April to August had consequences that I am still trying to understand. The first indication was in the April Transect data for Survey Zone 7, which was a 200 by 300 kilometer rectangle of open North Pacific, centered approximately 900 kilometers northwest of Hawaii. Zone 7 was a productive feeding area for multiple cetacean species in spring. Its cetacean density in April typically among the highest in the northeastern Pacific because of an upwelling pattern that concentrated prey in the upper water column across the zone for 4 to 6 weeks each spring. I had 14 years of April data for Zone 7, and the density curves were consistent, not identical year to year, but within a predictable range driven by the upwelling strength in any given year. In that April, the Zone 7 transect produced the lowest cetacean density reading in the 14-year record, not low for a weak upwelling year, low in an absolute sense, a count so far below the historical range that it would have been statistically anomalous even in the poorest upwelling years on record. I logged it and flagged it and moved on to the next transect zone. The upwelling data for Zone 7 that spring was normal. Prey concentrations in the upwelling area, which I tracked through sea surface temperature and chlorophyll satellite data as a proxy for the prey field, were within the normal range. The prey was there. The whales were not. I noted the discrepancy in the April survey log and filed it under anomalous density event, cause unknown. I had 2 more survey cruises before August, a June cruise and a July cruise. And in both of them, Zone 7 produced similarly anomalous density readings. 3 consecutive surveys, 3 months of anomalous absence, prey field normal each time. By July, I was no longer filing it under anomalous density event, cause unknown. I was filing it under something I did not have language for yet. Something that required me to look at the spatial pattern of the anomaly rather than the density numbers alone. Because in June and July, I had also run transects in the zones surrounding Zone 7, the adjacent survey areas to the north, east, south, and west, and those zones were not showing the same anomaly. Zone 6 to the north had normal density. Zone 8 to the east was normal. Zone 10 to the west was running slightly above historical average, which was interesting. The absence was specific to Zone 7 and its interior, not a regional decline. And in July, the absence had a shape. The cetacean density data, plotted spatially across the transect grid, showed a region of near zero density that was not following the boundaries of my predefined survey zones. It had its own boundary, an area approximately 380 kilometers across at its widest point, roughly circular, inside which cetacean density was essentially zero, outside which density was normal or slightly elevated, and the boundary between the two was sharp, not a gradient, not the kind of gradual transition you saw when animals moved away from a degraded prey field. Sharp, as if the animals on the outside of the boundary knew exactly where the boundary was. and had made a collective decision about it. I sat with the July data for 2 days before I went to my program director and said I needed to talk. My program director was Dr. James Ewan, 58 years old, a physical oceanographer by training, who had come to the initiative as its director 6 years prior, with a background in Pacific Current systems and a very precise mind for what oceanographic data could and could not support. And he was not a cetacean biologist, but he was an excellent scientist, and his oceanographic expertise was frequently the thing that kept my survey interpretations honest when I was inclined to overread biological patterns. I brought him the April, June, and July density data with the spatial plots overlaid, and I walked him through the Zone 7 anomaly and the boundary pattern, and the elevated density in Zone 10 to the west. He looked at it for a long time. He asked me about the prey field data, and I showed him the satellite proxies, upwelling strength, chlorophyll, sea surface temperature across the affected area. He said the oceanographic data showed nothing that would explain a cetacean absence of this magnitude. He said the upwelling pattern and the prey field were both normal for the Zone 7 area. He said what he was looking at in the spatial plot, the sharp boundary and the density gradient from near zero inside the boundary to normal or elevated outside, was the pattern he would expect to see if the animals had been displaced by something that the animals were aware of and that was occupying a specific geographic area. He said that was not an oceanographic explanation. It was a behavioral one, and he was outside his expertise on the behavioral interpretation. He said he was going to ask a colleague, a cetacean behaviorist at the University of Hawaii who studied avoidance behavior in large whales, to review the data. He said I should plan the August cruise with the specific goal of mapping the boundary more precisely. He said he wanted the August data before drawing any conclusions. I said I already had conclusions, and he said, I know, but I want the August data anyway. The August cruise was 12 days, and I ran it as a boundary mapping exercise rather than a standard transect survey, using the July spatial data as a guide to position the vessel along the apparent boundary of the anomalous zone, and then running perpendicular crossings through it from the outside into the interior and back out. What I found on those crossings was the thing that produced the conversation with James Ewan, in which I stopped being careful with my language and started being honest about what the data was telling me. The boundary was real, on every crossing in both directions. The transition from normal cetacean density to near zero was occurring within 8 to 12 kilometers of horizontal distance, say, which was sharp by any measure of cetacean distribution change in open ocean, and the boundary had moved. Comparing the July spatial plot to the August crossings, the boundary of the near zero zone had shifted approximately 40 to 60 kilometers to the northwest in the 5 weeks between the July and August surveys. The empty zone was not stationary. It was moving slowly, 40 to 60 kilometers in 5 weeks, which was approximately 8 to 12 kilometers per week, which was not fast in open ocean terms but was directional and consistent. The movement axis holding steady from southeast to northwest across the 5 weeks of comparison. I ran the crossings at the northwest edge of the zone, where the movement was taking the boundary into new water, and I ran them at the southeast edge. seeing where the zone was leaving water that had previously been inside it. At the northwest edge, the density transition was as sharp as everywhere else. Animals present in normal numbers on the northwest side of the boundary and absent on the southeast side. At the southeast edge, the trailing boundary, something was different. There were animals there, not in normal numbers, not the density I would expect for a boundary zone with normal prey field, but not zero either. They were present at the southeast trailing edge in reduced but real numbers, and their behavior, as far as I could observe from the vessel, was wrong. I had 14 years of cetacean behavioral observation, and the animals at the trailing edge of the anomalous zone were not feeding, not socializing, not transiting. They were milling, moving in slow, irregular patterns. Not the purposeful movement of animals with a destination. The behavioral literature on cetacean stress responses described milling as a characteristic of acute avoidance behavior when an animal had nowhere to go. These animals were at the trailing edge of something that had passed over them, and they were milling in its wake. I ran acoustic monitoring from the hydrophone array on every crossing. The acoustic data from inside the zone was one of the things I brought to James Ewan when I returned from the August cruise. And it was the thing that changed the tone of our conversation from careful professional review to something more direct. Inside the anomalous zone, the passive hydrophone array recorded near silence, not the normal acoustic environment of the open North Pacific, which was rich and complex. The background noise of shipping and geological activity and biological vocalization from dozens of species creating a continuous broadband signal, near silence. The biological acoustic layer was absent inside the zone. Not just cetaceans, the full biological acoustic layer from fish and invertebrate vocalization down to the shrimp crackle that formed the constant background of a healthy ocean was reduced to a small fraction of its normal level. Something inside the zone was producing an acoustic environment in which biological life was essentially absent or acoustically inert. I had the comparison recordings from the zone boundary and from outside the zone, and the contrast was not subtle. It was the difference between a forest and a room. James Ewan listened to the acoustic comparison recordings and was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "What do you think is inside it?" I said I thought that was the right question, and I did not have the answer yet. He said he was calling the University of Hawaii behaviorist, and he was also calling NOAA. The NOAA call happened 3 days later. 2 senior scientists from NOAA's Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center joined the call, along with the University of Hawaii behaviorist Dr. Keone Makoa, who had reviewed the data files I sent him and who asked questions with the focused precision of a person who had already formed a strong preliminary interpretation and was testing it against the original data. He asked about the milling behavior at the trailing edge of the zone. He asked about the acoustic silence inside the zone. And he asked about the elevated density in Zone 10 to the west, which I had flagged in July as interesting, and which the August data confirmed was real and elevated above historical range by 18%. He asked how many species were represented in the near zero zone during the August crossings. I said the interior of the zone was essentially empty of all cetacean species that I surveyed for, which was 12 species in total. including blue whales, humpbacks, fin whales, sperm whales, pilot whales, and 6 species of dolphins. He said all 12. I said yes. He said no species-specific pattern, no differential response, all species avoiding the zone at the same level. I said yes. He said that was significant. He said species-specific avoidance, where some species leave an area and others remain, was the pattern you saw when the driver of avoidance was something species-specific, a prey collapse or a predator that specialized on particular species. Universal avoidance across 12 species with different diets, different dive profiles, different acoustic capabilities, different predator threat responses, was the pattern you saw when the driver was something that all 12 species recognized as a threat. He said what recognized by all 12 species meant was something that was large enough and present enough that its acoustic or chemical or hydrodynamic signature was detectable by every cetacean type in the zone, and that every cetacean type assessed that signature as dangerous. He said large enough in this context was doing a lot of work and he wanted to be careful about it. He said the milling behavior at the trailing edge was consistent with animals that had been inside the zone or at its edge and had survived and were behaviorally disrupted in the way cetaceans were behaviorally disrupted after a significant predator encounter. He said he had seen similar milling behavior in humpback pods following orca attacks and in sperm whale groups following encounters with large shark species. But he had never seen it across multiple species simultaneously in open ocean, which was what the trailing edge data appeared to show. One of the NOAA scientists asked about the movement of the zone, the 40 to 60 kilometer northwest shift over 5 weeks. He said was the movement consistent with any known oceanographic pattern, current drift, prey field movement, anything that would move an absence zone in that direction at that rate. I said no. I said James Ewan had run the oceanographic analysis, and there was no current or oceanographic feature that was moving northwest at that rate in that area during that period. The NOAA scientist said, what was the mechanism of movement? I said, I believed the zone was moving, because whatever was inside, it was moving. He said he understood that. He said he wanted to arrange a vessel deployment to run coordinated surveys with my August boundary data as the starting point. He said he needed the zone's current position estimated so the deployment vessel could begin at the right location. I said I could provide a position estimate based on projecting the northwest movement rate from the August data, with the caveat that the rate might not be constant. He said he understood the caveat. He said he was going to move quickly on the deployment authorization because the zone was moving and every week of delay was 8 to 12 kilometers of additional drift. He said good documentation. James Ewan said the same thing after the NOAA call ended. I went home and looked at the August data again and thought about 12 species and universal avoidance and the acoustic silence inside a zone 380 kilometers across. And I thought about what had to be present in an open stretch of the North Pacific to produce those numbers. Not a predator. Orcas were the apex predator of the Pacific cetacean community. And orca presence produced species-specific avoidance patterns, not universal ones. And orca territory was not 380 kilometers across. Not a prey collapse. The prey field was normal. not an oceanographic anomaly. The water conditions were normal, something large enough and present enough to register on the sensory systems of 12 cetacean species as a universal threat, something that had been in Zone 7 since at least April and had moved 40 to 60 kilometers northwest by August and was still moving, trailing behaviorally disrupted animals at its southeast edge and carrying an acoustic silence with it wherever it went. The NOAA survey vessel arrived at the estimated zone position in mid-September. I was aboard as a survey specialist, along with Dr. Makoa from Hawaii and 2 NOAA cetacean scientists and a full acoustic monitoring team. The vessel was the research ship Kawamoto, 45 meters, well-equipped, and the crew were people who had run Pacific cetacean surveys before and knew what normal looked like. We found the zone on the second day, and the boundary crossing was as sharp as the August data had shown, and it stopped the Kawamoto's experienced chief scientist mid-sentence when the cetacean counts dropped from normal to 0 in the space of a 10-kilometer run. She turned to me and said, "You weren't overstating it." I said no. We ran a boundary circuit over the following 3 days, establishing the current extent and position of the zone and comparing it to the August data. The zone had moved 47 kilometers northwest since August, consistent with the estimated movement rate. It had also grown. The August data had put the zone at approximately 380 kilometers across at its widest. The September boundary circuit measured it at approximately 420 kilometers. I ran the comparison numbers twice. The zone was not only moving, it was expanding at approximately 10 kilometers per month in diameter, which meant it had been expanding from some smaller starting point before April, which was as far back as my survey data was dense enough to detect it. I brought the expansion data to Dr. Makoa. He looked at it for a long time. He said an expanding absence zone in the open Pacific across all cetacean species, with acoustic silence in the interior moving consistently to the northwest, was not something he had a framework for. He said he was going to be honest about that. He said the behavioral evidence, the milling at the trailing edge, the universal avoidance, the sharp boundary, was consistent with what he would call predator-mediated habitat abandonment, which was the technical description of what happened when a predator's presence was so pervasive and so recognized that prey species abandoned entire habitat areas rather than risk encounter. He said predator-mediated habitat abandonment at this scale was unknown in cetacean literature. He said the word "at this scale" was doing significant work, and he did not want to minimize it. He said the zone at 420 kilometers across encompassed more than 138,000 square kilometers of open Pacific, and the animals that had previously occupied that space were gone from it and were apparently unwilling to re-enter it, and whatever was generating that response was still inside it, was moving with it, and the zone was getting larger. The acoustic monitoring team ran continuous passive array monitoring throughout the September survey, and the silence inside the zone was confirmed. They also found something in the acoustic data at the zone boundary that the August hydrophone recordings had not captured, because the August recordings were from a vessel running crossings rather than from a stationary array. When they held the Kawamoto at the boundary and let the array listen for extended periods, They found that the boundary was acoustically active in ways that were not obvious from transit recordings. There were sounds at the boundary, not biological vocalizations, not the characteristic calls of any of the 12 cetacean species I surveyed. Sounds at the boundary that came from inside the zone and moved toward the boundary and then stopped. Low frequency, 15 to 40 hertz, which was the frequency range of some of the largest cetacean vocalizations, the blue whale call range. But these were not blue whale calls. The acoustic team's senior analyst described them as broadband pulses with a complex internal structure, multiple frequency components present simultaneously, not the relatively clean tonal structure of cetacean vocalization. She said the nearest acoustic signature in her reference library was the sound of very large biological tissue moving through water under high tension, the creak of connective tissue and muscle under load, the kind of sound you got when something very large was moving actively. She said the source localization placed the sounds at a range of 15 to 30 kilometers inside the zone boundary. She said at that range, generating the acoustic amplitude she was measuring, the source had to be large. She said large was not a technical term, and she was working on a better one. She put the analysis in a formal note and gave it to me and Dr. Makoa, and NOAA's chief scientist, and we read it together in the Kawamoto's main cabin. And the Kawamoto's chief scientist said what all of us were thinking, which was that something 15 to 30 kilometers inside the zone boundary was producing acoustic signatures consistent with very large biological tissue under active tension, and it had been there since at least April, and the zone around it was 420 kilometers across and growing. She said she was going to make a formal report to NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration when we returned to port, and she was going to recommend a follow-up deployment with additional acoustic and sonar capability. Dr. Makoa said he agreed with the recommendation. I said I agreed with it too, and I also said that the zone was moving 8 to 12 kilometers per week and expanding at 10 kilometers per month, and a follow-up deployment timeline that took more than a few weeks would be chasing a target that was continuously repositioning, which complicated the follow-up planning. The chief scientist said she understood that, and she would make the timeline constraint clear in the formal report. We returned to port at the end of September. What happened in October and November, I am going to describe from two sources: the data I continued collecting from shore-based satellite analysis of the Pacific Cetacean Survey Network data, and the field reports from two additional NOAA deployments that I was not aboard but that I was given access to as a contributing specialist. The second NOAA deployment in October found the zone at its projected position, now measuring approximately 440 kilometers across, still moving northwest, still acoustically silent in the interior. The deployment ran additional boundary characterization and attempted to do something the September deployment had not attempted, which was to run the survey vessel inside the zone boundary to conduct interior surveys. The first interior run was a 40-kilometer penetration from the southeast boundary heading northwest into the zone. The survey ran for approximately 4 hours before the deployment's chief scientist ordered the vessel to turn back. She filed a report on the interior run that I read carefully when it was distributed. She said the interior acoustic environment was as described in the previous deployment's data, near silence. She biological acoustic layer absent. She said the vessel had not encountered any biological presence in the 40-kilometer interior transect. She said the crew had been on watch for anything and had seen nothing. She said at the point where she ordered the turn back, the vessel's hull-mounted sonar, which was running at low power for navigation, had registered a return that the sonar operator could not classify. The return was large. The sonar operator's estimate was an object of significant horizontal extent at a range of approximately 18 kilometers ahead of the vessel's position, which placed it 18 kilometers deeper into the zone interior. And the return had been present for approximately 90 seconds of sonar data before the vessel began its turn. And then the return angle changed as the vessel came around, and the operator was not able to reacquire it on the return heading. She said the sonar operator's description of the return, which was in his written report, was an extended horizontal feature with irregular edges and a maximum dimension exceeding the sonar's reliable ranging capability at that power setting, which was 4 kilometers. She said the sonar was not designed for biological target characterization. The return could have been a geological feature in the water column, a thermal layer, a dense aggregation of organisms, or something else. But she said none of those explanations fully satisfied her, and she had ordered the turn back before reacquiring the contact, because the crew's safety was her first responsibility, and a contact of that description at that range inside a zone with that behavioral signature was not a contact she was going to investigate further with a 45-meter research vessel and a crew of 22. I read that report in my office in Vancouver and thought about a sonar return exceeding 4 kilometers horizontal extent at 18 kilometers range, inside a zone that was 440 kilometers across, carrying acoustic silence, moving northwest, expanding by 10 kilometers per month. I thought about the acoustic team's low-frequency recordings at the boundary, the sounds of large biological tissue under active tension from 15 to 30 kilometers inside the edge. I thought about 12 cetacean species with different physiologies and different sensory systems all registering the same response to whatever was inside. I thought about the trailing edge, the milling animals with no direction and no destination, the behavioral disruption of survivors. I thought about survivors, and I tried not to stay with that word. The third NOAA deployment in November was larger. A second vessel, a larger ship from NOAA's Pacific Fleet, joined the Kawamoto, and the acoustic array was upgraded to a military-grade passive system that one of the NOAA program managers had arranged through a contact at the Office of Naval Research. The zone was now at a position 680 kilometers northwest of its April origin point, and its diameter had reached approximately 470 kilometers. The November deployment ran the upgraded acoustic array at the boundary for 6 days and produced a data set that I will describe carefully because it was the data that finally produced something close to a consensus interpretation from the scientific team. The upgraded passive array had sufficient range and resolution to source-locate acoustic events inside the zone with a precision the earlier systems could not achieve. The low-frequency broadband pulses that the September acoustic team had recorded from 15 to 30 kilometers inside the boundary were re-recorded with the upgraded system and source located with higher confidence. The source localizations placed the pulses at a consistent range of 22 to 28 kilometers inside the southeast boundary, but the source was not stationary. Between the first and sixth days of the deployment, the source position had moved approximately 55 kilometers northwest, maintaining its position inside the zone as the zone itself drifted northwest in the same direction. The source was moving with the zone. The source was the zone. That conclusion, stated by the lead acoustic scientist in his preliminary analysis note, was the one that produced the most discussion among the scientific team. If the source was the zone, meaning if the thing generating the acoustic signature was the same thing that was responsible for the absence of biological life in the zone's interior, then the zone was not an environmental condition that an organism was occupying. The zone was the organism, or more precisely, the zone was the effect of the organism's presence, and the organism's presence was what was moving. Yes, and the zone moved with it, because the zone was what the organism's proximity did to the Pacific Ocean. Dr. Makoa's response to this interpretation in an email to the full team was careful and precise. He said the behavioral evidence, the universal cetacean avoidance, was consistent with an organism whose acoustic, chemical, or hydrodynamic presence was detectable by cetacean sensory systems at a range of 200 to 210 kilometers, which was half the diameter of the zone, meaning animals were responding to it at that distance. He said a cetacean's acoustic detection range for a large acoustic source in the 15 to 40 Hertz band could extend to several hundred kilometers under favorable propagation conditions, and if the broadband pulses were the organism's own biological sounds rather than movement sounds, the detection range could be even greater. He said the question of what kind of organism produced acoustic signals in that frequency range at sufficient amplitude to be the primary driver of 470 kilometer diameter cetacean absence was a question he was going to answer carefully and correctly rather than quickly. And he was going to need the full acoustic data set and more time. NOAA's program manager, who was on the email chain, said she understood, and she was extending Makoa's consulting contract, and she was also briefing NOAA's Director of Science and Research, because the preliminary findings were outside the normal scope of a cetacean distribution survey, and she needed institutional awareness at a higher level. She said the briefing would happen the following week. She said the data was to be considered pre-publication and not shared outside the team. I said I understood. I went back to my survey database and ran an analysis I had been building toward for months, going back through the full 14 years of Zone 7 and adjacent zone data and looking for any historical indication of the anomaly before April. I was looking for the zone's origin or the earliest detectable trace of whatever was causing it. The historical analysis took me 3 weeks. I was looking for density anomalies in the historical survey data that were below range, but not dramatically so. The kind of subtle signal that would not have been flagged as anomalous in any individual year's analysis, but that might be visible in aggregate across multiple years. I found it in the 10 years before the April onset of the full anomaly. And the Zone 7 April survey data showed a gradual, below-average density trend that, viewed in isolation from any individual year, looked like normal interannual variability, but that in aggregate described a slow, consistent decline over a decade. The Zone 7 April density in the year I identified the anomaly was not the first year the numbers had been low. It was the year they had crossed the threshold from low but within range to dramatically below range. Something had been present in or near Zone 7 for at least a decade before I noticed it, producing a subtle enough suppression of cetacean density that it had registered in my survey data only as normal variability, and it had grown slowly until the zone it produced was large enough and the suppression was strong enough to be unmistakable. 10 years of slow growth before I noticed it. I sent the historical analysis to the NOAA team and to Dr. Makoa. Makoa called me the same day. He said he had reviewed the historical trend and he believed it was real, and he wanted to discuss what it implied about the timeline. I said I thought the timeline implied the zone had been present and growing for at least a decade, possibly longer. He said yes. He said if the zone had been present for 10 years and was now 470 kilometers across, the expansion rate was slower in the early period than it was now, which was consistent with growth. He said something that was growing was not the same as something that had always been this size. He said he wanted to be careful about that distinction because it mattered for what kind of thing this could be. I said I understood the distinction. He said, what I want to tell you, and I am telling you as one scientist to another rather than in my formal consultant role, is that the acoustic source data and the behavioral data and the zone expansion data taken together describe something in the North Pacific that has been getting larger for at least a decade, and that is now 470 kilometers across in terms of its behavioral footprint. And the only organism category that fits those parameters at that scale is something we do not have a category for. I said I had reached the same conclusion. He said the NOAA director briefing was happening in 2 days, and he was going to be present, and he wanted me to be present by video link. He said the director was going to ask the question that everyone had been careful not to ask in writing, and he wanted us both in the room when she asked it. I said, what question? He said she's going to ask how big it is. The NOAA director briefing happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was on a video link from my office in Vancouver. Dr. Makoa was in Washington. The NOAA director, a woman named Dr. Yolanda Reyes, who had 30 years of marine science behind her, and the direct manner of someone who had received a great many difficult briefings and had learned to ask the right questions rather than the comfortable ones, received the presentation from her team and listened, and then asked the questions they were prepared for, and then asked the one they were not. She said, what is generating the acoustic signature? In your best scientific judgment. The lead acoustic scientist from the November deployment said the acoustic signature was generated by a large biological organism, origin unknown. She said large in what terms? He said the source localization and amplitude data were consistent with a biological acoustic source of significant size, and he wanted to provide a more precise estimate, but the data did not fully support one. She said, give me your best estimate with appropriate uncertainty. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the amplitude and source characteristics were consistent with a biological organism whose acoustic output in the 15 to 40 hertz range exceeded the output of any documented cetacean species. He said to produce the observed amplitudes at the documented source ranges, the organism would need to be substantially larger than a blue whale. She said, how substantially? He said his estimate, with wide uncertainty bounds, was an organism whose acoustic output suggested a body mass at least an order of magnitude greater than a blue whale. A blue whale was approximately 150 tons. An order of magnitude greater was 1,500 tons. She looked at those numbers and did not say anything for a moment. Dr. Makoa said he wanted to add that the behavioral zone, the 470-kilometer diameter area of cetacean absence, was consistent with an organism whose sensory or acoustic presence extended approximately 200 to 230 kilometers in all directions from its body center, and that for an organism to have a biological acoustic presence that was detectable and interpreted as threatening by 12 cetacean species at 200 kilometers distance, the organism needed to be generating that signal continuously, which implied it was a natural function of the organism's biology rather than active signaling, which implied the organism was not trying to be detectable at that range. She said, it's not broadcasting. He said no. He said what we were detecting at the boundary was the passive acoustic signature of a living organism that was not doing anything special. It was just present. And its presence, the ordinary biological noise of something that large simply existing in the water, was enough to empty 470 kilometers of open Pacific of every cetacean species that had the sensory capacity to detect it. She said, where is it going? I answered that one. I said the movement axis had been consistently northwest since I identified it in August, and the historical density data suggested the southeastward displacement from Zone 7 over the preceding decade, meaning the zone had been moving northwest for at least 10 years and possibly longer, and at the current rate the zone would reach the waters south of the Aleutian Islands in approximately 8 months if the movement rate and direction held. She said what was in that area. I said the Aleutian Island chain and its surrounding waters were one of the most productive cetacean habitats in the North Pacific. High prey density, multiple species present year-round, including significant blue whale and fin whale populations. She said it was going toward the highest cetacean concentration in the North Pacific. I said yes, she said deliberately. I said I could not determine intent from movement data. She said, I understand that. And she said she was going to escalate the briefing to the Department of Commerce, and she was going to request an interagency coordination meeting with the Navy, because whatever was being described in the data was operating in U.S. and international waters at a scale that was beyond the scope of NOAA's response capacity, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She said the team was doing excellent scientific work and she wanted it to continue. She said she appreciated the rigor and the honesty of the reporting. She said the meeting was over. I went home and looked out at the Pacific from my apartment in Vancouver, and the Pacific looked the same as it always looked, which was large and gray and occupied only by what I could see, which was its surface, which told me almost nothing about what was below it. The Aleutian projection turned out to be wrong. Not wrong in direction, wrong in timing. The zone did not take 8 months to reach the Aleutian waters. It moved faster in January and February than it had in the preceding months. The movement rate accelerating from 8 to 12 kilometers per week to 20 to 25 kilometers per week. A rate increase that the acoustic team noted coincided with a change in the broadband pulse character, the pulses becoming more frequent and the low-frequency component becoming more pronounced, which the acoustic scientists interpreted as increased activity level in the source organism. The zone reached the southern approaches to the Aleutian chain in mid-March, approximately 5 months after the director briefing. And what happened to the cetacean populations in the zone's path, I documented through the satellite survey network data, which gave me population distribution at lower resolution than field surveys, but across a much larger area and in something close to real time. The whales moved. The blue whale groups that had been concentrated in the high productivity waters south of the Aleutians began dispersing in February, before the zone had reached them, which meant they were detecting the approaching zone at a range of at least 300 kilometers. The detection range had increased from the 200 to 230 kilometer estimate in September. The zone had grown, and the organism inside it had grown, and the passive acoustic signature that emptied ocean of cetaceans had grown with it. The fin whale population, which I had been monitoring via satellite telemetry data shared with me by a NOAA colleague, showed a dispersal event in the last week of February. Animals that had been in consistent positions for months, suddenly transiting rapidly east and west way from the Aleutian approach corridor. 31 tagged fin whales, all of them moving within 72 hours of each other, all of them moving away from the zone's projected approach path, with a coordinated clarity that implied they had received and acted on the same information simultaneously. I sent the fin whale data to Dr. Makoa. He called me within the hour and said they all moved at the same time. I said yes. He said they don't school. Fin whales don't coordinate like that. I said I know. He said something told them simultaneously. I said, or they all detected the same threshold event simultaneously and responded the same way, which would produce the appearance of coordination without requiring direct communication. He said yes. That was the more parsimonious explanation. He said what threshold event? I said I thought the organism had produced an acoustic event that reached the fin whale's positions simultaneously, and that event had triggered the dispersal. He said an acoustic event that reached all 31 whales simultaneously from their distributed positions around the Aleutian approach corridor would have had to originate from a point source and arrive at widely separated locations in the same time window, and which, given the speed of sound in water and the separation of the animal's positions, was consistent with a source that was still several hundred kilometers south of the leading whales, but that produced a pulse large enough to reach all of them at the same moment. He said the acoustic amplitude required to do that. He didn't finish the sentence. I said, I know. He said, it's getting bigger. I said, yes. The interagency coordination meeting that the NOAA director had requested happened in April. I was not in it. I was given a summary of the portions that were not classified, which was less than half of what was discussed. The summary told me that the Navy had been tracking the zone's acoustic signature with its own hydrophone network since November and had substantially more data on the source than I did. Seeing that the Navy's characterization of the source was consistent with the NOAA acoustic team's characterization in category and inconsistent with it in scale, meaning the Navy thought it was larger than the NOAA team's estimate. The summary told me that the interagency meeting had agreed on a monitoring protocol and had agreed not to attempt any active acoustic or physical engagement with the source organism until further scientific review was complete. It told me that the zone was now being monitored by assets I did not have access to, and that NOAA's role in the investigation was being coordinated with other agencies. It told me that I should continue my survey work and maintain my data sharing agreement with NOAA, and that my contribution to the investigation was valued. I read the summary 3 times. Then I went back to my survey data and ran the current zone position estimate and the current diameter estimate from the satellite network data I still had access to. The zone diameter in April was approximately 680 kilometers. In the 14 months since I had identified the April anomaly in Zone 7, the zone had grown from 380 kilometers to 680 kilometers, an increase of 300 kilometers in diameter, and it had moved 800 kilometers to the northwest. In the same period, the northeastern Pacific cetacean populations that I had been monitoring for 14 years had undergone a redistribution that the satellite data showed unlike anything in my longitudinal record. Species that had occupied the zone's previous location had not returned to it. Species ahead of the zone's current position were abandoning their historical ranges. The 680-kilometer zone of cetacean absence was not following the whales. The whales were preceding it. They were staying ahead of it. They had been staying ahead of it, apparently, for at least 10 years. The gradual displacement of cetacean populations from Zone 7 and its surroundings that I had found in the historical analysis, now visible in a larger context as the leading edge of a decade-long reorganization of cetacean distribution in the North Pacific. The whales slowly yielding a growing area of ocean to something they had been detecting at the edges of their sensory range since before I had the data density to notice. 10 years of slow displacement, 14 months of identified zone, and the zone was 680 kilometers across and moving and growing, and the Navy had told NOAA it was larger than NOAA's estimate. I thought about Dr. Makoa's email. What kind of organism fits those parameters at that scale is something we do not have a category for. I thought about the fin whales dispersing simultaneously in February. I thought about 12 species with different sensory systems all registering the same response. I thought about the acoustic silence inside the zone, the biological acoustic layer gone, not just cetaceans, but the full biological community that made the normal North Pacific sound like life. I thought about the things I had been careful not to think about in the formal scientific context, the things that were not supportable from the data alone, but that the data kept pointing toward when I was not being careful about what I was thinking. Something in the North Pacific had been growing for at least 10 years. It was now 680 kilometers across in terms of its presence in the ocean, which was not the same as 680 kilometers in body length, but was what 680 kilometers of body presence in the ocean looked like from the outside when you were standing at the edge of where life ended and trying to understand what was on the other side. Every cetacean species I had ever surveyed for, every animal I had counted and logged in 14 years of transect work, had a sensory system that said, "Stay away," and they were all using it. 14 years of knowing the Pacific from the numbers it produced, and 1 year of learning that the numbers had always had something inside them that I had been reading as variability. I am still running the Northeastern Pacific Survey. The survey routes have been modified to avoid the zone, which means my transects now loop around a space I cannot enter and cannot sample. A space that's larger than England and France combined and growing by 10 kilometers per month in diameter. The cetacean populations I can sample are compressed into smaller areas outside the zone boundary. Their densities elevated in the regions that remain available to them. The whales packed into shrinking habitat, the way populations compress at any boundary. The NOAA monitoring continues. The interagency coordination continues. My data sharing agreement continues. I receive monthly updates that tell me the zone's current position and diameter and movement vector, which I compare to my satellite network data and find consistent. The updates do not tell me what the Navy's estimate of the source organism's size is. And they do not tell me whether the acoustic engagement prohibition is still in effect. They tell me the situation is being monitored and managed, and that my contribution to the monitoring effort is ongoing and valued. In April of next year, my survey program will reach 15 years. I will run the same transects I have run for 15 years, on the same routes in the same seasons with the same methodology. The Zone 7 transects will loop around the zone boundary the way they have looped for the past year. The numbers I produce will be compared to the numbers from the 14 previous years, and the anomaly will still be there in the data, growing, moving, the same absence it has been since before I knew what I was looking at. I think about the fin whales dispersing simultaneously in February. 31 animals, distributed across hundreds of kilometers, all receiving the same signal at the same moment and all making the same decision. I think about what it is like to be a fin whale, a 50-ton animal in open ocean, with the most sophisticated low-frequency hearing system on Earth, and to receive a signal in the 15 to 40 hertz range. That means something you have no name for but respond to with your entire body before you have finished processing what you heard, a signal from 300 kilometers away that says leave now, says nothing about what is sending it or why or what it wants, only that it is there and it is large, and it has been getting larger for longer than any of the animals responding to it have been alive, has been getting larger for longer than any organism responding to it has institutional memory of, has been growing in the North Pacific in the dark and the cold and the depth for a time that none of us, the whales or the researchers or the Navy operators or the program managers writing the monthly updates, have a number large enough to hold. It was there before any of us were listening. It will be there after we stop. The zone is 680 kilometers across and moving northwest, and every week it is 20 kilometers wider, and every week the whales are 20 kilometers closer to the coasts that are the last direction available to them, and whatever is inside the zone is not following them, has never been following them. What is inside the zone has never changed its heading or its pace for anything that moved out of its way. The Pacific reorganizes around it because the Pacific has no choice. Because 680 kilometers of absence does not negotiate with anything, does not adjust to anything, does not notice anything at its edges. And the whales that have been reading its presence for 10 years, with every sensory system they have, are reading the same message they have always read, which is simply that it is there, which has always been enough, which has always been the only thing it needed to say.